All right, good evening. We are getting ourselves started. We are sponsored this week by Shmuley and Miriam Fuchs, Le'ili Nishmas Shmuley's mother, Bailey Yentel Bas Elchanon, and we are on Daf Mem Vav, Amud Aleph, the very last line. Boi Rami Bar Chama. Rami Bar Chama asks a question, and he wants to know. We talked about mountains. They can't be consecrated as Avodah Zara because they're attached. Let's say, and then we had talked about the stones that get carved out of the mountains. So Rabbi Chama wants to know. Habishtacha ve'lahar. So let's say some mountain is worshipped by idols. So avanav mahu lemizbeach. Can they take the stones out of the mountain, quarry the stones, and use them to build a mizbeach for korbanos for Hashem? So the issue is that we know that since the mountain can't become Asr Behanach, can't become prohibited as getting benefit. But the question is, can it get some other lesser prohibition attached to it? Meaning, we have things that are not prohibited to use, but we have things like an animal that has somebody's had relations with it, or the financial compensation for prostitution. So those things they're not prohibited. That money is not prohibited to get benefit from. Nevertheless, there is a prohibition against using them in the Beis Hamikdash. So the question is, can you take these stones and use them for creating a mizbeach? If after all, there really isn't a prohibition in using them in general, but there could be there could be this extra level of caution that we need to use when it comes to using things in the Beis Hamikdash. So yesh ne'avad b'mechubar eitzel gavoha o ein ne'avad b'mechubar eitzel gavoha. The real question really comes down to something that is attached to the ground that was used as avodah zarah. Even though it's permissible for an individual, can it still be prohibited for use as for idolatry? Yes, Yuda.
So you're saying before about part of the mizbeach is not to be used for from the part of the adultery cannot be part of the mizbeach.
Yes, that's our question. That's our question. So, im timtze lomar yesh ne'avad b'mechubar eitzel gavoa, if we're going to say that there is such a prohibition, that something that is worshipped for idolatry, that even though it was attached to, and the mountain can't itself become prohibited as idolatry, but nevertheless we can't use it for a mizbeach. So machshire korban ke korban damu. The question becomes, those things, they're not really it's not a korban itself. This is something which helps make a korban. It's building the mizbeach. It's not actually the korban itself. Olo, or do we say no? There's no such thing, right? Once it's permissible for use, it's permitted. Amar Rava. So Rava says kal v'chomer. We're going to learn a kal v'chomer, and it's going to work like this: ma esnon, the financial contribution made to a prostitute. So shemuter betolush lehediot. That is something, it's not attached to the ground. There's no prohibition in using that for a regular person, right? Meaning that if she goes to the store and she decides that she wants to go purchase her groceries with that money, there's no prohibition against using that money. It's aser b'mechubar ligavoha. If she was getting some kind of land payment, something that was attached to the ground, that land payment, despite the fact that we can't turn something into an idolatrous purpose if it's attached to the land, nevertheless, a prostitution payment made from land is prohibited from being used in the Beis Hamikdash. So we see that despite the fact that there's a distinction between something when it comes to Avodah Zara, there's a distinction between something attached to the land and not attached to the land. When it comes to payment for prostitution, there isn't a distinction between the two. And we see that it cannot be used, despite the fact that it is separated. It cannot be used for building cannot be used for building a mizbeach. Can't be used for service of a korban. Dichsiv, as the pasuk says, lo savi esnan zona umechir kelev. You're not allowed to bring the payment for a prostitute or the payment for a dog, right? If you buy a dog, right, that is a debasing financial use, and we don't want to use that money in the service of the Beis Hamikdash. So lo shno tolush v'lo shno b'mechubar. It makes no difference whether that payment is cash or whether it's land. It doesn't make any difference. It's prohibited against using it in the Beis Hamikdash. So therefore, nevad, when we're talking about idolatrous, something used for idolatry, she'aser betolush lehedyot, that if it was a cash payment, if it was a object that was being worshipped, a gold statue or whatever, so then it would be prohibited for use for an individual. Eino din she'aser b'mechubar legavoa. For sure, it should have a prohibition attached to it when you're talking about a land payment or a land avodah zarah item shouldn't be able to be used in the Beis Hamikdash, right? So it seems like there's idolatry is more severe than these other types of prohibited payments because the idolatry actually can become prohibited for a regular person from using at all. So Amar le Rav Huna braid Rav Yeshua le Rava. So Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yeshua, says to Rava, O chilof. Or you could take this kal v'chomer and you could flip it the other direction and work like this. Uman nevad she'aser betolish etzel hedyot. So if you're going to take this item that is worshipped as idolatry, and you're going to tell me that it is prohibited for an individual, if this item was not attached to the ground, right? You had a statue, so it would be prohibited for an individual to get any benefit. Mutter b'mechubar legavoa, it would still be permitted for an individual when it's attached to the ground, a piece of land, for example. And then also, we would then drive the conclusion that it's permissible for it to be used in the Beis Hamikdash. Shenamar, as the pasuk says, Elohehem al heharim velo heharim Elohehem, the pasuk that we used yesterday, that the mountains are where their gods are located, but the mountains are not their gods themselves. So therefore, they cannot consecrate a attached mountain as an idol. So lo shno lehedyot velo shno legavoha. So that doesn't make any difference whether that belongs to the Beis Hamikdash or whether that is a regular individual. It's permissible. So then esnon, when we come to the payment for prostitution, shemutter betolosh lehedyot, that doesn't have any prohibition when it comes to something which is detached, a physical item. Eino din shemutter b'mechubar legavoa. For sure, it should be permissible to use an attached piece of stone for creating a mizbeach, right? That shows that if that which is more prohibited is permissible to build a base of a mizbeach out of, then certainly something which is less permissible should be acceptable to build a mizbeach out of. So now we're gonna answer that in a second. But Yehuda's got another question. Go ahead, Yehuda.
When you were mentioning about them worshiping the mountains, right? Does that mean they have idols hidden in some of the caves in the mountains or something?
No, the idol worshiping the mountain means the mountain itself is the idol that they're worshiping. They like this mountain. This mountain is the god. That's what we're talking about. So ve'imi shum beis Hashem elokecha. So now, if you're going to tell me that, hey, you know what? There's a pasuk. The pasuk says that lo savi estan zona mechir kelav beis Hashem elokecha. You cannot bring these payments to the house of Hashem your God. But that pasuk can be from this pasuk. We're going to prohibit the bringing of an item for service in the Beis Hamikdash for a korban itself, right? It has to be an item that's brought to the house of Hashem as a sacrifice, and we say that's prat lepara shena ba'a lebayis, right? Which is going to exclude things that can't be brought into the Beis Hamikdash as a donation. So, for example, if the animal being brought in, if the payment is a cow, right? He says here is if it's and it can't be brought into the Beis Hamikdash in order to slaughter it, right? It has to be slaughtered. This is the para aduma. Sorry, I should mention that it's the para aduma we're talking about. If we're talking about an item which is the para aduma, so the para aduma doesn't have a prohibition against being, let's say somebody paid they exchanged, they bought a dog with a red cow, right? So now they want to use the paraduma for making it a paraduma. So the pasuk says you can't bring it to the house of Hashem. A paraduma doesn't go into the Beis Hamikdash. A paraduma is burned outside of the Beis Hamikdash. It's a service which is done on the mountaintop across and facing the Beis Hamikdash. It actually doesn't go into the Beis Hamikdash at all. So So that's what what Divrei Rabbi Eliezer Omer. That's what Rabbi Eliezer explains and says that there's no prohibition against using a item which is a prostitution payment or a payment for a dog in service of a para aduma. And the Chachamim Omrim and the Pasiks and the Chachamim disagree, and they say lerabos es harikuim. It's to tell me that the prohibition in the Beis Hamikdash includes, it comes not to exclude something, but to include that if you took the gold that was used as a payment and you smashed it down into making flat plates, they would use these flat plates of gold to as a wall covering on the inside of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies. They would have gold walls, gold-plated walls. So that gold, if they use that gold, even though that's not actually physically part of the Beis Hamikdash, it's not part of any service, nevertheless, since it goes into the Beis Hamikdash, it's prohibited for being used if it came from one of these prohibited sources. Okay, so that is what the Chacham. So now, we this pasuk, right? This pasuk, Beis Hashem Elokecha, right? So that pasuk is not coming to tell me that the prohibition of the payment for a prostitute or that which is connected for goes into Hashem. So we don't have an answer to tell us that that would not be prohibited. So therefore, the question is in place: can something which is attached to a mountain, is there an additional level of prohibition that, despite the fact that it's permissible for an individual, which way are we going to learn this Kal V'chomer essentially? Are we going to presume that it's permissible, or are we going to presume that it's prohibited based on this Kal V'chomer? So Amar Le, so he says back to him, Ana kamina l'chumra v'at amars l'kula. You've got two ways to learn this Kal V'chomer, this logical deduction. You can learn it stringently and say that if a payment for a dog or a prostitute cannot be brought into the Beis Hamikdash for use, then for sure this idolatrous stone can't be brought in. Or you can learn it leniently and say, since the stone can be brought into the Beis Hamikdash, so then anything that's attached to the ground that's used as a payment, that also can be brought into the Beis Hamikdash. Those are two ways to learn it. One provides a great leniency. One creates a stringency. Which of those two versions of this Kal V'chomer are you going to learn? So the answer is kula v'chumra l'chumra parchinon. When you have a choice and you have to go lenient or strict, so you're supposed to learn the Kal V'chomer. The rule is you learn the Kal V'chomer strictly. You're going to learn it strictly and prohibit it. Okay, so Amar. So therefore, the answer is that this hewn out stone, if this mountain was worshipped, right, and they carve out the stone and they bring it and they want to build a mizbeach out of it, cannot use it, right? Despite the fact that an individual could use it to build his house, you can't use it in the Beis Hamikdash. The Beis Hamikdash has got a higher level, and that is not to be used. Amar li Rav Papa li Rava. So Rav Papa says to Rava, "V'chol heicha deika kula v'chumra lekula lo parchinon." You're telling me that the rule is, this is a rule that I'm going to question. This is the rule. I've got a Kal V'chomer, and this Kal V'chomer can be learned two ways. One way is leniently, one way is stringently. And you're telling me I always have to presume, if I've got both ways and both ways are equally valid, so then I've always got to use the strict way. Who's to say that that's the case? V'ha hazah de Pesach. What about the case of the sprinkling of the paraduma water on Erev Pesach? Here's what happens. When somebody becomes tamei, they cannot bring a korban Pesach unless the entire nation is tamei. Then somebody can bring a korban Pesach in the state of tumah. But if the majority of the Klal Yisrael are in a state of purity, so then a person who's tamei on first Pesach doesn't bring a korban Pesach. He waits till Pesach Sheni. Here's a person who is tamei, and he comes to the Beis Hamikdash 7 days before Pesach, and he starts the process of purifying himself. The process takes 7 days. He has to be sprinkled with the paraduma on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. Turns out that this year, Erev Pesach fell out on Shabbos. Okay, so since Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, no, it doesn't. The korban itself is not tamei. Yehuda, but you'd ask the question, wouldn't it make the korban tamei? No, he's not touching the korban, right? This guy who's tamei, he can send the korban with his friend who's completely tahor, right? This guy, he makes a neighborhood block party. 3 or 4 neighbors get together. One guy is completely tahor. He brings the korban. He stays at home. He's got to take care of his getting sprinkled by the ashes of the paraduma. Problem is it's Shabbos. The Rabbanan made a rule on Shabbos that you're not allowed to get sprinkled with the ashes of the paraduma if your seventh day of sprinkling comes out on Shabbos. Why? Because there is a d'oraisa rule that if you cannot complete or fix a utensil on Shabbos. As a result, the Rabbanan made the rule that anything that looks like it prepares an item for use is rabbinically prohibited on Shabbos as well. So here's this person who cannot bring a korban pesach. If he sprinkles himself with the ashes of the paraduma, he becomes ritually pure, making himself ready to make a korban pesach. That sprinkling is prohibited midrabanan. It's rabbinically prohibited. Okay, so that's what's going on here. So there's an argument whether that rabbinic prohibition was suspended for the sake of being able to eat the korban pesach, or whether that rabbinic prohibition was in place and you couldn't get sprinkled and therefore you were stuck and you had to make a Pesach Sheni. So, de pligi Rabbi Eliezer for Rabbi Akiva. It was an argument between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Eliezer holds lechumra. He holds stringently the kamechayev le gavra, and he says that he learns a kal v'chomer, and he says that you're not allowed. One second. Then he says a kal v'chomer like this. If you're allowed to do shvita of the korban pesach, you're allowed to slaughter the korban pesach on Erev Shabbos, which of course everybody was doing. They went to the Beis HaMikdash and brought their live animal, and they were doing shchita. That violates a Torah prohibition. Doing shchita is against HaShabbos midoraisa, and that's permissible. So kal v'chomer, the rabbinic enactment, should also get pushed off, and this person is obligated to bring the korban pesach. And so therefore, we're going to push off this prohibition d'Rabbanan. That's how Rabbi Eliezer words. For Rabbi Akiva lekula, Rabbi Akiva is going to say, no, we're going to learn this leniently, and we're going to say that if you, I guess the lenient way of looking at it is since you can't override the d'Rabbanan, which we're going to explain exactly how this kal v'chomer works. Because the way the kal v'chomer work the other way is you can't override the d'Rabbanan, therefore you also can't do shchita, but we know you can do shchita. So let's hang on, we'll see how Rabbi Akiva's side of the kal v'chomer works. Okay? Upater, and therefore he's going to say that you can't bring the korban pesach, right? You're exempt from the korban pesach because you can't sprinkle the ashes on that seventh day. Now, v'kaparach Rabbi Akiva. Here's what the question Rabbi Akiva, how he asked the question. He says, v'kaparach Rabbi Akiva lakula, and Rabbi Akiva is learning this kal v'chomer in a lenient way. Now, here's how it works. It's none. Here's the actual Mishnah that learns the kal v'chomer and teaches it in both directions. Heishiv Rabbi Akiva. Right? Rabbi Akiva says, we know the kal v'chomer of Rabbi Eliezer, that was straightforward. If you can do the d'oraisa of shchita, for sure you can do the d'Rabbanan, the rabbinic, of sprinkling the ashes. That's how Rabbi Eliezer works. Rabbi Akiva says, o chilaf, or flip it around. Umah hazoh shehi mishum shvus ein adochas haShabbos. Look, the rabbinic enactment of sprinkling the paraduma doesn't push off Shabbos. Let's start with that presumption. And shchita, shehi d'oraisa, that would make us come to the conclusion that slaughtering the animal, which is a Torah prohibition, lo kol shkin, for sure that doesn't violate Shabbos. Which means that Rabbi Akiva is coming out, you can't do shchita on your korban pesach on Erev Shabbos. So, and what are you seeing here is that Rabbi Akiva is learning the kal v'chomer in a lenient way, despite the fact that we had two ways of learning it, a strict way and a lenient way. And we said the rule is you're always going to go in a strict way, not in a lenient way. How come Rabbi Akiva is learning it in a lenient way? So the Gemara says, Hasam, there where we're talking about the sprinkling, Rabbi Eliezer Gomrei, ve'ayaker le Talmuda. What happened was Rabbi Eliezer got stuck. This is how the argument went back and forth with Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Eliezer wasn't sure what the halacha is. Rabbi Eliezer wasn't sure whether the sprinkling is going to override Shabbos or not. So therefore, Rabbi Akiva came along and decided what the Asr Rabbi Akiva comes along, La'ad Kurei, and he wanted to remind Rabbi Eliezer, who was his Rebbe, what the halacha was. So therefore, he came up with a bogus kal v'chomer, right? And said, hey, if you can't violate the Shabbos, then for the rabbinic enactment, for sure you can't do the Doraisa, to which Rabbi Eliezer says, of course you can violate for the Doraisa. That we know, the Pasuk says you're supposed to do the Korban Pesach, even if it comes out on Erev Shabbos, you're supposed to do the Korban Pesach. Oh, so Kal V'chomer, you can violate the Durabanan. So Rabbi Akiva set up Rabbi Eliezer to remind him. V'hainu Damarle, that's what it means when he says back, when Rabbi Akiva says to Rabbi Eliezer, Rebbe, al tach pireni b'sha'as din, right? He says, um, do not atone for me, right? Do not come be upset with me when it comes time to be judging. Kach mekubal ani mimcha hazos shvus ein docha es Shabbos. He says that this was what I recall, right? That the rabbinic enactment does not push off the Shabbos, right? Even for the Korban Pesach. So therefore, Rabbi Akiva wasn't pushing off the Kal V'chomer. He was just saying, look, it's a rabbinic enactment. It doesn't follow a logical discussion, right? It's just that I'm trying to remind you that this is the halacha that you taught us, that the rabbinic enactment is still in place and you can't get sprinkled on the seventh day. Okay, so therefore, Rabbi Akiva wasn't trying to actually learn the Kal V'chomer in an opposite way. He was just trying to remind Rabbi Eliezer of the rule that Rabbi Eliezer had taught them. Okay, so therefore, the rule is, if you've got a Kal V'chomer that goes both leniently and strictly, we're always going to learn it strictly. The reason why Rabbi Akiva learns one that in a lenient way has nothing to do with Kal V'chomer. It has everything to do with just trying to remind Rabbi Eliezer of a law that Rabbi Eliezer had taught him earlier. Okay, so now, Rami Bar Chama is going to bring another concern. Okay, that was the first concern, was we want to know about using stones for idolatry in the Beis Hamikdash. Next question. Boy, Rami Bar Chama wants to know. Let's say you have standing wheat, right? You have grain that's in the field. It has not been cut down yet. Okay, so since it's attached to the ground, it's not rabbinically prohibited because it's still attached to the ground. Now, we did know that Rabbi Yosef Yehuda felt that it could be prohibited, but we're going according to the Rabbanan. We'll see that in the Gemara coming up. But therefore, since it's still attached to the ground, it's not prohibited. So, mahu leminachos. Can this grain, when it does get cut down, can it be used as a fine flour for offerings, right? For flour offerings. Can we grind this wheat up and use it for flour offerings? Because the question is like this. Yes, shinoi bin avad. It's going to get cut down, and then it's going to have its shape and form changed. Since its shape and form is changed, because he has the presumption, now that we've come to the conclusion, you can't use the stone from the mountain, in building a mizbeach. Therefore, the wheat theoretically shouldn't be able to be used as a korban either, despite the fact that it's standing, it's not prohibited for an individual to use. It could be prohibited to use in the Beis Hamikdash. But this wheat is a little bit different than the stone, in that the wheat changes form completely. It's not a standing stalk of grain anymore. It's going to be fine flour by the time it makes its way to the Beis Hamikdash. So the question is, the fact that I'm prohibited against using this in the Beis Hamikdash, is that offset by the fact that the item that I'm using actually changes form completely? Oh, ain't shinoi b'nevad. Or does it not matter? The fact of the matter is, when it was a grain, when it was standing wheat, it became worshipped, and therefore now, even if we turned that item into grain later on, into fine flour later on, it still remains prohibited. Okay, so that's our question. Amar Marzutra Brei de Rav Nachman. So Marzutra, the son of Rav Nachman, says, Toshma, come and listen. We're trying to answer this question. Kol asurin legabe mizbeach. If I have something that is prohibited from being used as a sacrifice in the Beis Hamikdash, right? For example, an animal which was set aside for use for Avodah Zara, right? That would be prohibited. Or somebody has relations with an animal, that we said also you cannot use that animal as a korban. Vladosehem mutarin. When the animal has offspring, the offspring is valid, right? Vitani Allah, and we learned about that. Rabbi Eliezer Oser. Rabbi Eliezer says they're not allowed. So now we have to figure out what's the case. V'lav itmar Allah. So didn't we explain this being the case? Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabbi Ravua, Machlokes keshenirbu uluvasof ibru. This argument is when the animal, the action which made the animal prohibited, the bestiality that happened before the animal became pregnant. Okay, so the animal became prohibited, and then the animal became pregnant. The animal, the offspring, becomes what we call zev v'zeh gorem. Zev v'zeh gorem means that two things are causing the baby animal to come into existence: the prohibited mother and the permitted father. So therefore, since you combine the two together, this is the argument when it comes to that case. And that is that Rabbi Eliezer says, Zev v'zeh gorem, if you've got something which is partially caused by a prohibited action, by a prohibited item, and partially caused by a permitted item, it's prohibited. And the Chachamim disagree and say if it's partially created by a permissible item and partially created by something that's prohibited, then the item is permitted. That's what that argument is about. That has nothing to do with wheat. In a wheat, right, the grain, the fine flour comes directly from the kernel of wheat, which was directly from the sheaf, which the standing wheat. It's completely caused and brought about by the standing wheat. So therefore, everyone would agree that it would be prohibited. About ibru ulavasof nirbu. However, if the case was that the animal was already pregnant, the mother, the cow was already pregnant, when the Avera happened that caused the cow to be prohibited, Devrei HaKol Asurin, everyone would say that the animal, the baby inside of the mother is part of the mother and therefore prohibited, and everyone would agree. That issue is as he said, is a zev v'zeh gorem. It's because there's a father and a mother and the two things combine. If the baby is there already, so then the offspring, according to everybody, would be prohibited. V'hachanami. So here too, when it comes to the standing grain, ke'ibru ulevasof nirbu dami. It's like you've got the animal, the pregnancy, meaning the fine flour is already contained in this kernel. It just needs to be brought out. So therefore, it's more like the animal that was pregnant when the Avera happened. Ikadamri. Okay, so now this is a different version of the same discussion. Ikadamri, the Itmar law, Amar of Nachman, Amar Rabbi Avua, that some said it was Rav Nachman, said the name of Rabbi Avua, Machlokes Keshenir Be'u Ibru. The argument between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim, that it was that this is Rav Nachman, Amar Rabbi Avua, said it himself, that the argument is when the animal was made invalid first and then became pregnant. And that's because we said as zev gorem, both things are causing it. Aval ibru ulevasof nirbru, but if it became pregnant first and then became prohibited, so the divrei hakol also, then everybody would say it's prohibited. V'haninami, so too by the standing grain, ki ibru ulevasof nirbu dami, it's as though the grain was already the flour is already contained in the kernel, and therefore it is just one cause, and it would be prohibited according to everybody. Okay, so that's his proof. Now, the Gemara says that's not really a proof. Hachi hashta. How can you compare the case of a pregnant animal to a standing piece of wheat that becomes flour? That's not the same thing. Because hosam meikara behema, v'hashta behema. When it comes to an animal that was pregnant, the baby animal, the fetus inside, was its own fetus. It's the same thing. And now that it's born, it's the same item. It didn't change forms. You had a fetus that became a baby animal. And all it is doshahu dachiza be'anpa. It basically, the only thing that happened is the animal was born. The door opened and the animal went out of its mother. And now you have an animal on the outside, whereas you had an animal on the inside before. Same item. So therefore, there's no change. Hacha, but here when it comes to the wheat, meikara chiti v'hashta kimcha, a change, a physical change from a kernel of wheat to ground flour may be more significant a change than an animal that's a fetus to a baby animal. So therefore, the question could still stand. Okay, so now we leave that question and we ask another question. Okay, boy, Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish wants to know, Hamishtachava ledekel. Let's say somebody bows down. Let's say idolaters are bowing down to a palm tree. Lulavo mahu. Can you use the lulav that grows from that tree on Sukkos? Right? We know that we said that we can't use the stones that come from attached item for the Beis Hamikdash. Using a lulav for a mitzvah is not the Beis Hamikdash, but it's also not personal use. Personal use is permitted. What's basically, we're asking the question, what's the status of a mitzvah? Is the mitzvah more similar to a service in the Beis Hamikdash, or is a mitzvah more similar to a personal practice? So lulavu mahu mitzvah. Can I use a lulav for the mitzvah? So the Gemara says, let's say you had a tree that was planted for the sake of Avodah. Remember, we talked about the Asherah trees. It makes a difference at what point it was planted and at what point it was served. So let's clarify that for a second. If I'm talking about a tree that was planted at first for the sake of idolatry, lo tiboiloch, then there's no question. Nobody says there's any part of it that's going to be permissible. We said that already has human interaction with it, and that's going to be no good for sure. Dafilu lehedjot nami yoser. Even if you cut that tree, can't use any part of that tree for anything, let alone for a mitzvah. That's not the question. Kiti boilach, the question that is be'ilon shenotu vasof avdo. You had a natural growing tree, and in the end they started to worship it. And, right, aliba de Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda lo tiboilach. We're going to take Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda and put him on a side for a minute. Because Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, if you will recall, said that if the tree got worshipped after it was already planted, that's also prohibited. That tree is also prohibited. So that's not going to be the question. Afilu lehedjot nami also. So he's going to say that that tree also is prohibited for individuals. Kiti boilach aliba the rabbanon. The question is according to the rabbis. Le'inyan mitzvah mai. What is the case as far as using this tree, which we said can be used for personal use? Can I use the lulav for a mitzvah? Mimois klape gavoa. Do we say it's disgraceful to Hashem? Olo, or it's fine for personal use? A mitzvah is like personal use. So the Gemara is going to try to explain and provide some clarity to Reish Lakish's question. Ki also Rav Dimi, Omar, when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael, yes, Yehuda.
But technically speaking, if people are worshiping a palm tree and use a little for sukkahs, how is that prohibited?
That's the question.
Yes.
Is it or isn't it? That's the question, right? So Ki also Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael, Omar, he said, Ba'ashera shebitla kami boile. Where also happens to be that that this question could also apply if a non-Jew came and nullified the Avodah Zara properties, as we said, that a non-Jew can remove the idolatrous properties from that tree, right? So now the question could be, dichui eitzel mitzvos o ein dichui eitzel mitzvos? That question now is a different question, because now the question is, if the tree was worshipped and you cut the tree down, it became prohibited. Now comes a non-Jew and he says, I'm nullifying this tree from idolatry. Now it becomes permitted. Is there a concept that once something cannot be used for a mitzvah, that it can never be brought back to be able to be used in a mitzvah again? Right? We're going to see that such a concept exists by korbanos. Does such a concept exist by mitzvos as well? So, okay, so tifshut le midisnan. So that we can answer that issue, whether a mitzvah gets pushed off or not, from another Mishnah. And that Mishnah is in Chulin. Kisahu v'nizgoleh. If a person slaughters a bird or slaughters a non-domesticated kosher animal like a deer, a gazelle, or some kind of animal like that, so there's a mitzvah called kisui hadam. The blood goes onto the ground and you take dirt and you cover the dirt. Let's say that the blood was covered and the wind comes and blows the dirt off, and now the blood is uncovered again. Potzer milichsos. You don't have to cover it again. The mitzvah was to cover the blood. You covered the blood. The fact that it's exposed the mitzvah is not undone by the wind coming and blowing the dirt off. That's what it says. However, kisoh haruach, if the wind covered it in the first place, so now you missed the opportunity to cover the blood. The wind came and covered it. But then the wind came and uncovered it, so the mitzvah was never done on the blood. You are chayiv, you have to cover the blood with dirt. So chayiv lechasos. And so therefore, what do you see? There was a moment in time when wind came and blew the dirt over the blood, and the blood was now not obligated to get covered. Then came the wind and blew the dirt off, which makes it able to be covered again. So you see that there's no such thing as dichui, as having some item become prohibited from being used as a mitzvah, and then it cannot be used when it becomes eligible again. So too, we should be allowed to use this lulav that became ineligible for a period of time, but now can be usable again. V'amar Rabbi Bar Chanan Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Bar Chanan said Rabbi Yochanan, Lo shanu ela shechazar v'nisgale. That's only if we're talking about the wind blew and covered the dirt, and then the wind blew again and uncovered the dirt. Aval lo chazar v'nisgale. However, if the dirt remains covering the blood, so then patrim l'chasos, then you're exempt. So therefore, you see that when it's covered, it is not you're not liable to, you're not responsible to cover it. Then when it blows it off, you become responsible again. So therefore, something that was not able to be used for a mitzvah becomes eligible to be used as a mitzvah again. So we talk about this. We ask this issue, right? Why does it make a difference if it got uncovered again? Once it was covered, it's covered. So it's no longer, there's a point in time at which there's no mitzvah to cover the blood. Why does the mitzvah come back? So Amar Rav Papa, so Rav Papa says, Zos Omeres ein dichoy etel mitzvahs. We've come to the conclusion that there is no such concept as something is not able to be used for a mitzvah. Okay, so the Gemara says, the Rav Papa gufe iboile. So that which Rav Papa wants to know, right, that there's whether this mitzvah is pushed away or it's not pushed away. That was that which he asked, mifshat pshitale. This was clear and well known to the Tanaf, to the person in the Mishnah, that there's no such thing as blood, as an item being removed from being able to be performed in mitzvos. Lo shna lekula v'lo shna lechumra. It makes no difference whether we're talking about for stringency or leniency. Meaning, the question is like this: why is it that we have to recover the blood again? Are we recovering the blood because the Tana in the Mishnah wasn't sure whether you needed to cover the blood again, and therefore may as well, just to be sure? That's a stringency. Whereas when it comes to the lulav, can I use this lulav? I'm not sure. The stringent thing would be to not use it, not to use it. So therefore, am I saying the law is that an item can't be removed from being a mitzvah and then come back? Well, then I'm going to be consistent. And that means that I'm going to cover the blood again, and I'm going to be able to use this lulav. But if the issue here is that I'm not sure what the law should be, and therefore I'm covering the blood just to make sure, then I also shouldn't use this lulav just to be sure. So that's the question. That was what Rav Papa wanted to know. If the Mishnah says that you have to cover the blood, is the Mishnah telling us that you have to cover the blood just to be sure as a stringency, or is the Mishnah telling us that is the halacha? Oh, Dilma, Savuki Misafkali. The Tana in the Mishnah was in doubt. So he said, just be strict, cover the blood again. You got nothing to lose, don't make a bracha again, but cover the blood. So, and Lakula lo amrinam. But if it came to a case of our lulav, don't be lenient, don't use that. So that is the question. So teku, so that we don't have an answer to. Thought we had an answer, but it's not really an answer. So we don't know. So therefore, in practice, don't use a lulav that comes from a worshipped Asherah tree if you come upon such a thing. Okay, next. Boy Rav Papa. Rav Papa wants to know more issues. Let's say somebody's bowing down to a sheep. Can you use the wool to dye it tchelas and put it in your tzitzis? Right? That's the issue. So, or no, we're not going to say in tzitzis. Tchelas is used for several things. So can I take the wool and I use it for tchelas? So the Gemara wants to know, tchelas demai, what are we using this tchelas wool for? If we're going to take this blue dye and we're going to put it into making garments for the Kohen Gadol, right? The blue dye was used to make many of the garments of the Kohen Gadol. So maybe that's what it's being used for. So, Hainu boi dermich bar chama. That was Rabbi bar Chama's question. Remember about using the worshipped stones in building a mizbeach? That was that same question. Why are we asking the same idea? Can I use the worshipped wool for the garments of the Kohen Gadol? And if the question that you're asking is, can I put the tchelas in my tzitzis? Well, then you're asking, can I use the worshipped item for a mitzvah? And that is Hainu Boyd Reish Lakish. That was Reish Lakish's question. He already asked that question. So either way, the question's already been asked. Why are you asking this question again? So the answer is, in achinami, you're right. There's nothing new to that question. Delo hava lemiboile. You're right. Rav Papa didn't have to ask this question as well. V'ayidika boile ha mishum deika mili achra nyasa. The answer is Rav Papa was just bringing that issue up because you're right. Those questions were already asked, but he had a whole series of questions, and that was the first statement introducing a series of questions. And the series is like this. Samra ma'ul tchelis. We don't know what the deal is with the wool, using it for tchelis dye. Karneho man mahu lechatzosos. Can you take the horns of a ram worshipped for idolatry and use them as trumpets, or I guess as shofars, in the Beis Hamikdash? Can I use those? Right? Shokeha mahu lechalolin. Can I take the bones of the femur bones and make flutes out of it? I guess they used to make that they're hollow and they make good musical instrument material. So can I use that for making a material instrument? So bnei me'ah mal leforos. Can I use the intestines to make strings for stringed instruments? Now, what were they using these instruments for? These instruments were used to play the music accompanying the korbanos. So they want to know, can I make it? So now why isn't it the same question again? Are we not having the same question again, taking an item that was worshipped and using it in the Beis Hamikdash? The answer is not necessarily. Aliba demand amar ikar shira bikli loti boiloch. It's two different perspectives as to how the songs that came in the Beis Hamikdash worked. Way number one to look at it is that the songs in the Beis Hamikdash had musical accompaniment. The musical accompaniment was part of the mitzvah. If you didn't play the instruments, the korban is not valid. So according to that opinion, these musical instruments are required for the service. If they're required for the service, it's the exact same question about using the stones for the mizbeach. And then then there's no point in asking the question again. However, devadei also, for sure it's prohibited. We already said that those stones are prohibited. For sure, you can't make musical instruments that are necessary for the service in the Beis Hamikdash using this prohibited items. Kiti boilach, the question is, aliba demanda amar ikar hashira bepeh. The question is, according to the opinion that says that the musical accompaniment really is singing. You're supposed to sing. The music that comes along with the singing is only to beautify it. Besume kala biyamahu. The music, that's just to make the singing sound very good. So therefore, the music is unnecessary. So therefore, he's asking the question. I know that the music is unnecessary, but since it comes in part of beautifying the service in the Beis Hamikdash, can I use that there? That was the question. Umaisinon odilma afilu hachi aser. And so now he's saying, or maybe it's still prohibited because it's still part of the service. So tekus. We don't have an answer to that one either. We're getting used to that. So boy Rabbi. So Rabbi wants to find the answer to this. Let's say the idol worshippers are worshiping a spring. Okay. Now, the thing about water is it's not stationary. So what is he doing? He's worshiping a spring. What exactly is he worshiping? Meimov mahu linechasim. Can you take the water and use that for the service on Sukkot, where you pour the water on the mizbeach? That's an essential part of the service. But we're not really sure whether the water becomes the idol. That's the issue. My kami boiler, what was his question? Ilema libabua kasagid is the issue that what's he worshiping? Is he worshiping the image, his reflection in the water? So then odilma lemaya kasagid, or is he worshiping the water? Well, that makes a difference. If he's worshiping the water, then it becomes prohibited. He can't use it. But if he's worshiping his reflection, the water's fine. V'tiboile seifel lehedyot. So then the question that he should have asked, if that was his question, he should have asked the question, forget whether the water is usable in the Beis Hamikdash, ask whether the water is usable for anybody, right? Because if it was worshipped and it's water, it's not attached to anything, so then the water, just take a water in a pail, right? If you had water that was detached, then the question is, when he takes a bowl and he worships the water in the reflection in his kiddie pool in his backyard, is he worshiping his reflection or the water? That would also be the same question. Why did he have to pick a case of the Beis Hamikdash? So liolam lemaya kasagid. So the answer is no. He's worshiping the water. That's clear. That's not. Right? Did I say clear? That's the water, right? This was the question. Lemaya de kame kasagid. Is he worshiping the water that is right here in front of him? The kamai azdu. and the water is not here anymore. In a spring, the water is flowing, it's moving. So if he worshiped the water that's here today, tomorrow it's not the same water. Okay? Odilma lidavruna demaya kasagid. Or is he worshiping all of the water that's in the spring, and therefore all of the water in the spring now becomes prohibited? And Dad, yes.
So didn't the Egyptians worship the Nile?
Yes. And so therefore the question would be whether you could use the Nile for service, right?
Yes,
But it was not near the base of English, so probably
that's true. True. But
less practical.
worshiping
but we did use the Nile for service because we are Moshe had the Nile for the blood and frogs.
Which is not a korban, right? It's not the same thing as spilling the water on the mizbeach, right? That might be an issue, Yehuda. You're right. If it's for the sake of a mitzvah, and then it goes back to our old question whether something that is used in idol worship, but the Gemara does not bring that issue in, right? It's a fair question whether we say, well, Moshe Rabbeinu did a mitzvah with it. Was Moshe Rabbeinu really doing a mitzvah with the water, or was his mitzvah to hit the water and then the water was the object? Could be a lot of answers, conversations to it. Now, the answer is the water is not prohibited anyway, so we don't have to get into all of that. Umimitas, right? The water prohibited. The Halmar Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yotzadok. Here Rabbi Yochanan said the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yotzadok. Mayim shel rabim ein nesarim. Public waterways cannot be prohibited. Why? Because we had the rule that we learned before that a person cannot damage his friend's item by worshiping it. Right? If I go and worship my friend's car, doesn't mean that his car now has to be burned, right? So the water of the Nile can't become prohibited because it was public. So therefore, that water of a spring also is public. So it can't be made into something that's prohibited. So lo tzricha, so you're right. The question has to be asked is the kadnave me'areh, that this guy's spring was on his personal property, was on his land. So if the guy owned the spring, then he could worship his own spring. And then if he was owning his own spring, then the question is, would that prohibit it? Okay, so that's the end of that series of questions. We move on to the next Mishnah. Okay, next Mishnah. Misha haya koslo samach lavodos kam. Somebody has a townhome, right? He's got his house, and then attached with a wall in the middle is a church, right? Or the holy Avodah Zara. Now, nafal, the wall in between falls down, needs repairs. Aser livnoso, you can't fix it. Because if you fix it, you're fixing the Avodah Zara. So you can't. So Ketzad Yaseh, what's he supposed to do? Kones besoch shelo arba amos. He moves 4 amos into his own property, and then he builds there, right? He builds on his own ubona. He builds in his own property. Now, let's say the wall itself wasn't on his property. The wall is split 50-50. Half of the wall is on his property, half of the wall is on the other property. The wall has a thickness. Half of the wall is on his property, half of it is on the other property. Nidon mechza al mechza. Then you presume that half of it is on his property, half is on the Avodah Zara. So when you count your 4 amos, you count your 4 amos from halfway through where the bricks used to be. That's where your property line is. So therefore, you count from there, you move back 4 amos, and that's that. Okay. Avanav eitzav ve'afaro. Now, the building materials from the fallen wall, what happens to those? So mitamin. So the Chachamim established, those are now going to be considered like a object that is part of Avodah Zara, used for Avodah Zara, and they're tameh, just like the item that is used as a sacrifice for Avodah Zara. Kesheretz, like a sheretz is. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, sheketz tishatzenu, that which is used for Avodah Zara should be disgraceful. Rabbi Akiva says kenida, that the level of prohibition should be like a nida, which is a different level of tuma. Shenemar's pasuk says tizreim kemo dava, they should be scattered like a nida. Say tomarlo. Ma nida mitama b'masa. What's the difference? The difference is in practice. A nida, if somebody picks up this rock and carries it, so then you become tameh by carrying the rock. right? So too, merely carrying, even without touching it, right? If you take a shovel and you dig it up and then you throw it up, you become tameh, which is not the case by a sheretz. Sheretz, you have to actually come in contact with it in order for the tumah to be transferred. So therefore, that would be the practical difference. Okay, says the Gemara. Now, you're moving yourself back 4 amos from the property line. The Gemara wants to know, you're giving the idolatry extra space now. That's kind of a good thing for the idolatry. How is moving back helpful to prevent us from worshiping the Avodah Zara? We're just giving it more space. What you got to do is you got to put a bathroom there in those 4 amos, right? Put something disgraceful in that space so that the Avodah Zarah doesn't creep into your space and move onto your property, but put something there that is not honorable, right? How are you supposed to put a bathroom outside your house right next to the Avodah Zarah, and that's not modest, right? It's not modest. So the answer is, he makes a nighttime bathroom, right? It's a nighttime bathroom. It's in the dark, so therefore it's private enough. Porta potty, that's right, Yehuda. So we are on 4070. Thank you. Yes, we are at the just finished the top Mishnah. There's several Mishnahs on this page. We're at the Gemara. Mar said, Ezehu tsanua, what is a modest person like? He uses a bathroom at night, just like his bathroom during the day, meaning he's got walls on it, he's got a door on it. He shouldn't be in public. That's not a nice thing to do. So now, the Gemara says, the Gemara in Brachos says that even though, right, you don't have to go as far a distance at night in order to be able to get into a private location to use the bathroom, right, you do have to be modest in some kind of a way. So to be out there in the open next to your house to use the bathroom outdoors, that's not so modest. So the answer is, da'avad le sinokos. The answer is, he makes a bathroom for kids. Right? They don't have to worry about sias. So therefore, that's what's out there. He puts that bathroom for kids out there. Inami, the answer is, or else he makes, like Yehuda said, a porta potty, right? You put up some hedges, a light fence, and some kind of screen, right? Then you could use it as a bathroom. But that's the bottom line. Move back, but don't let the idols just take over the space. Next Mishnah. Shlosha batim. There's 3 different halachos when it comes to houses, right? If somebody builds a house as a Avodah Zarah temple, right? There's 3. Did I say 2? 3, right? 3 types. So 3, number 1, somebody builds a temple for idolatry. Hareze Oser. That house is prohibited. There's nothing you're going to be, that's unless, I guess, a non-Jew comes and nullifies it. That's prohibited. Siyado v'kiyado le'avodas kochavim v'chidesh. Notel mashe chidesh. So let's say they add on an addition, right? Or they replaster it, they beautify it. Somebody buys an old shul and then they replaster it and turn it into a temple for idolatry. So when you buy that, all you have to do is scrape off all of the additions, all of this new stuff that they put in, scrape it out, and you could go back to the way it was. The stuff basically as a house and it's connected to the ground, the initial house does not become idolatrous if they added onto it to make the idolatry. If all they did was move their idol into the house and then the idol goes away, that's fine. That's like the bathhouse that we had at Rabbi Gamliel, right? They put the idol in, so they take the idol out, it's gone, and you're fine to move back in. Says the Gemara. Amar Rav says, lebayis osro, right? Somebody worships the house itself, right? Now we're talking about the temple, right? If somebody worships the house itself, that becomes prohibited. Alma kasover tolish ulevasov chibru ketolish dami. He says that Rav must hold that something which was not connected to the ground, these bricks are not connected to the ground, but then you build a foundation and you build the house and it's connected to the ground, he holds, nevertheless, it's a movable item. Even though nobody can pick up a house and move it, it's still considered to be not an attached item. That's what he holds. V'hanan bena'otnan, but the Mishnah says that if it was that it has to be built for Avodah Zarah in order for it to be prohibited, the Mishnah doesn't say that one type of Avodah Zarah is a house that is worshipped. In order for it to be prohibited, it has to be built for the sake of Avodah Zarah. So the answer is, if he builds it as a temple for Avodah Zarah, even though nobody actually worships that building, so then that is going to be prohibited. But if the building is actually worshipped, the building itself is the god, then even if it wasn't built for the purpose of being a temple, right, and they do it later, that's also going to be prohibited. Ihachi, so if that's the case, so shlosha arbahov, what do you mean there's 3 types of buildings? Now there's 4 types. You just added a new type of building, the building that's being worshipped. So the answer is kevan de le'inyan bittul tanan, since as far as nullification is concerned, there's no way for us to nullify this building and make it permissible unless we've got a non-Jew to do it for us. It's all considered the same type. Basically, built for a temple, built as a temple, or if it is worshipped itself, that's going to be the same idea, the same thing. All right, we're at the next Mishnah. It's 9:30, good place to stop. And we will pick this up tomorrow.
Yasher koach. Thank you very much for the class.
You're very, very welcome.
Again tomorrow.
Yes, now I got to make sure that I know how to stop.